In this blockout process tutorial, we're going to focus on blocking out the interior from concept art. And we're going to block out this interior motel room that will include a room and a bathroom. And this idea, this interior environment, was inspired by this concept art, created by Sylvain, and I'm not going to try to pronounce the last name. And one of my favorite places to create have always been motels and hotels, whether it's exterior or interior. So I'm going to use this concept art as an inspiration to block out this interior. And you can visit the ArtStation page and see all the concept art that this artist created. And the interior shot, the concept art piece, is under Dark Days. And if you scroll down, it's right here. And there are a few other similar feel and similar atmosphere art pieces that could be used to expand from the interior room of the motel to include other environments, such as a hallway with the rest of the rooms and an exterior shot. So let's go ahead and begin. In the previous blockout process, I showed you a time lapse, a very quick beginning to end result of a sped up time lapse. And in this blockout process video, we're going to take it a bit slow. And it's going to be more of a step-by-step workflow of what it took to create the interior. I will speed up some parts, but overall, everything will be shown and what it took to create it. So for this blockout interior, I'm going to use an empty level. First, I'm going to create a box. I'm going to drag it from the geometry menu right into the perspective viewport, and then zero out the location of this brush, so I know I am working from the center of the world. Since this is an empty level, I like to create from the world origin. Now this is just a personal preference, and you really don't need to do that. Then I'm gonna press Shift 5, this switches me over to geometry editing mode, and I'm gonna drag the top face down, and this will be my floor. I always start with the floor, so that way I'll be able to place my mannequin, my human reference scale, right on top of it, and it'll give me a place to start with. Thickness of 20 units for walls and floor is a good value to start with, and that's what I usually use, and it's my go-to. Now the size of the floor, the width and the length, I don't really know that size yet. And by looking at this floor, it's very difficult to tell how big this actually is. So the second step, after having a ground plane, is to insert a human reference scale, something you can use to judge proportion and dimension of your environment. And for this, I always use UE4 Mannequin. You can either use UE4 Mannequin Mobile, which you can download for free from the marketplace, or if you include a third-person game template, you'll find a mannequin to use there. And right away, I can tell how big this ground plane is. So just by having a human reference scale, you can already begin to judge proportion of your environment a lot better. And now I can go back into geometry editing mode and begin to resize the floor to match the concept art. So now I'm beginning to establish the floor of the room and how big it needs to be. And I am eyeballing the width and the length based on the human reference scale I have inserted and by looking at the concept art. So I'm not using any specific dimension other than looking what I have inside the editor. So this looks and feels like the right size, at least to start with, and we can always change it later. Now, one of the most frustrating things about BSP brushes in UE4 is the pivot points, especially after you use geometry editing mode to resize your brushes. And without going too much into this, you can see that the pivot point on this brush is off somewhere in space. So this becomes difficult to duplicate brushes and then move them. So a quick tip is you can right click on a vertex of a BSP brush. This will move the pivot point there, but then you need to save it. So in an empty space, right click to bring up the menu, go to pivot, and then choose set as pivot offset. This will save the pivot point on that vertex. And I have a hotkey assigned to set as pivot offset, so I can just move the pivot point by right clicking and then using the shortcut to save that pivot point. And this will greatly speed up your workflow. Alright, so now moving on, I've taken the floor and I duplicated it, and I'm using the geometry editing mode again to resize the brush to create the wall. All wall thicknesses I keep at 20 units, unless there is a special case, but most of them are kept at 20 unit thickness. And the height for the wall, a good standard height for an average size wall of an interior room, such as the one we are creating, is 300 to 350 units. And I resize it down to 300. And to get the measuring tool that you see that I'm using, you just middle mouse click and drag, and this will give you the measurements. And I am always jumping back into the perspective viewport and judging the size of architecture, the floor and the wall I have now, up against the mannequin, the human reference scale. And I cannot stress this enough, how important it is to get your initial dimensions right. Because from this point on, everything will be based off of this floor and this wall. So if it's too tall, or if it's too small and too cramped, then I can only blame the beginning proportions being incorrect. Because everything will be duplicated from this size of the wall and built around this floor. So it's very important that you get these first few architectural dimensions right. So I feel that the floor and the wall seem to be the right size. They look right based from what I'm going for in the concept art. And now I'm going to start creating the doorway and the windows. So I'm going to drag a new BSP brush. And for the doorway, good dimensions to start with are 110 in width, 210 in height, and 20 units in thickness. And then I'm going to change the brush type to subtractive. This way we can begin to carve out the doorway from our wall. And I'm going to position this subtractive brush right into the wall. And we have our doorway. And I feel like it might be a bit too small. So here comes the real test. I'm going to insert a point light. And I'm going to increase the intensity of it fairly high. And then I'm going to spawn inside the map. And this is the true test of our scale and our dimensions. Nothing will ever come as close to seeing your environment from player's point of view. And as soon as you can, you should jump inside the map and playtest. Just like I did here very early on with just a few brushes. And I feel like the floor and the wall are the right size, but the doorway needs to be a bit bigger. So I'm gonna make it wider by 10 units and make it taller also by 10 units. And then I'm gonna spawn again and take a look. And that feels a lot better, more natural and more correct. So right now I'm gonna quickly insert post-process volume and adjust auto exposure settings. I always do this in the beginning of the project because I don't want that automatic eye adaptation where the light gets brighter or darker depending where you are. I have a tutorial on how to do that. But basically you insert the post-process volume, change minimum and maximum brightness to 1, and enable infinite extent unbound to make this post-process volume universal. And this will remove that annoying auto exposure, that eye adaptation. That happens automatically. This will make the light effect a lot darker than it was, so I'm also going to increase the light's intensity a lot higher. And now I'm going to move on and begin to block out the windows. I'm going to select and duplicate the existing subtractive brush for the door and use it for the windows. I don't have a specific size for the windows that I'm using, other than that I'm looking at the reference and I'm using the size of the wall to determine where to place the windows and how big they need to be. And I'm noticing that the wall needs to be a bit bigger, so I'm going to go ahead and change that, making it a bit longer. And I'm going to change the floor to match the wall. So at this point, I am looking at the concept art, and I'm looking at the BSP Blockout, looking at the door, the windows, the wall, the floor, and I already jumped into the map, and I know how it feels to the player. And to me, this feels good. I'm very happy with the result, with the dimensions, the scale, the proportion, and this is going to be the size that I use. So it's very important that I get these essential basic architecture dimensions right, because from this point on, the entire interior will have to fit into this space. And it's not that I can't change it later. The whole point of Blockout is constant iteration. But if you spend the beginning of the Blockout the correct dimensions you're going to use for the rest of the project, it will greatly speed up the rest of the Blockout. And before I continue, I'm gonna go ahead and save this so I don't lose the work. So the rest of the block out should be a lot faster now. I'm gonna take the floor, duplicate it, move it up. This is going to be the ceiling. And I'm gonna jump inside the map right away because I wanna see how it feels to the player so it's not too cramped. Once you add the ceiling, you do want to jump into the map as soon as you can, because that's where the environment could feel too small, and if you catch it soon enough, you can adjust the wall height so you don't have to do it later to a lot of brushes. So hopefully, as I'm showing you this, giving you enough tips so you don't have to redo a lot of your work, and you're able to catch these problems, these issues early. My next step is I'm gonna start blocking in the beds. To get the bed size right, I'm simply gonna use another BSP box. And I am gonna enter a few specific dimensions into the X, Y, and Z to get the initial size, but it's gonna be a lot faster by switching to geometry editing mode and resizing it that way. It's gonna be more intuitive and a lot faster. And by using the mannequin, you can judge the proportion of the bed pretty accurately. And I'm actually gonna duplicate the mannequin, rotate him, and place him on top of the bed. And most of the blockout process from here on out is going to be based on what I see, what it feels like, and what it feels like to the player in game, rather than specific values to use. So I'm gonna finish off resizing the bed and jump inside the map. And I'm just making judgments about the size, of how tall it should be, and just based on experience standing next to a bed. And I think it's a bit too tall, so I'm gonna quickly resize it, move it down, and jump back in the map. And I think this looks pretty good. So jump inside your map as often as you can, and I'm gonna keep mentioning this throughout the video, that there is no better way to judge your scale of the environment by spawning inside the map and seeing it from the player's point of view. I'm gonna go ahead and select the bed, and I'll grab one of the mannequins and duplicate it for the second bed. I'm gonna leave space in between because this is where I will place a cabinet, a small nightstand, in between the beds. And I'm gonna just duplicate the BSP brush that I'm using for the bed and then resize it. And that looks pretty good. I'm gonna call this done. Now let's take the BSP brush for the wall. I'm gonna duplicate it, rotate it, and I'm gonna use this brush to create the wall next to the beds. So I'm beginning to close off and create the interior because the height of the walls feel good and the width of the entire floor plan also seems right based on the reference concept art. So I can begin to close off the interior space with the walls. Alright, this is now beginning to come together. I'm gonna start expanding to the other side of the room. On the other side we have a cabinet and a TV on top of it. So I'm just gonna take the nightstand BSP brush and begin to resize it. And at this point I'm beginning to eyeball all the dimensions based in relationship to the room, to the floor, and to the human reference scale. And then I'm gonna duplicate the brush again, and this is where the TV is gonna come from. So I'm just gonna resize it. And to continue to maintain the correct scale and size, I am duplicating the mannequin and then positioning next to these pieces of geometry. And then I'm gonna spawn inside the map, take a look before I move on to the next step. So during this blockout process, nothing is final, and if I catch any problems, any dimensions that are off, I fix it right away. And I decided to add additional layer of detail for the beds. So I moved them away from the wall, and I duplicated the bed, and I'm gonna create a bedpost. This is not necessary, but it helps me to visualize the space better. And having that secondary layer of detail on top of the main shapes helps with that. And then I'm also going to add a couple of pillows on each bed. Again, adding those secondary shapes of detail to help to sell the scene better. And I'm also going to take each mannequin on the bed and rotate them so they're laying on top of the pillow. Small adjustment. So I do often add a secondary layer of detail on top of the primary shapes. So let's spawn and take a look from player's point of view. And everything's looking pretty good. The size, the dimensions, and the floor plan, they all feel right. I'm going to take the wall, duplicate it, and move it for the other side. And now the space begins to feel like an interior room. And now I'm going to quickly create a front platform that's going to be outside the door and outside the window. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I just want to have something in front, outside, something like a sidewalk that would appear right outside the door. And I'm just going to duplicate the floor, move it in front, give it some size, and make it larger on each side. And I'm going to quickly play test and check. Alright, now I'm going to expand and begin to add more detail, more furniture on the other side of the wall, next to the cabinet and the TV. So I'm going to begin to speed some of these parts up, because there's nothing really new that I'm doing at this point, other than duplicating the brushes and blocking the rest of the furniture. And here I duplicated the cabinet, and this is going to be the starting point of the couch. And to mention this again, I have the concept art, the reference that I'm blocking in from, on the second monitor. So as you see what I'm blocking out, I am looking at the concept art the entire time. And I'm always judging proportion, scale, and dimensions from the reference, and as I'm working in UE4. After the couch, I want to block in a few more things. One is going to be the lamp, and for this I'm going to bring in a new cylinder and begin entering a few dimensions. This is going to be the starting point of the lamp, or the lamp shade. And I'm going to redrag the mannequin back so I can better judge the size. And it's way too big, so I'm going to resize it and make it smaller. So when you first create a piece of geometry, you do have to spend a bit more time than usual in order to get the correct size. But then after that, all the additional shapes are a lot faster to create. So creating the post and the base, after I get the lampshade correct, becomes a lot easier. So make sure you spend the necessary time to get that first shape, that first piece of geometry, and its proportions correct, because everything else will stem from it and will be judged to the first shape. Here's another playtest. Judging the couch, the space between the couch and the bed, the overall floor plan, and the size of the lamp. And everything's on point. I'm going to quickly create a trash can next to the lamp, and then I'm going to duplicate the same trash can for the other side of the couch. And the reason I'm creating these small pieces of geometry, which seem unnecessary to block out, is that I would eventually export them into a 3D modeling software so I know how big to create those props. And to go back on the previous point, it helps me to visualize the space better by having the extra elements, those additional brush details. Next, I'm going to block out the coffee table that's going to be in front of the couch, and I just reused the brush from the couch, duplicated it, and then resized it. And then I'm going to grab this table, duplicate it, and I'm going to use it to create another table next to the windows. And I'm just going to resize the brushes to create a larger table, more of a desk. So try to reuse already existing geometry as much as you can to speed things up. And then I'm going to create a couple of chairs. One is going to be next to the desk, and the other one's going to be next to the door. And I'm going to insert another light so I can see what I'm doing. And as you probably noticed, I rarely work using unlit mode because it's hard to see. And I'm usually using the lit mode, and for that I insert temporary point lights around the scene. Now, during the blackout, you don't want to focus on lighting or tweak any lights. That's not the point of the blackout. But it does help if you insert a few lights to get a general idea of lighting for your scene. So insert a few point lights, few spotlights, and if it's an exterior scene, insert a directional light and a skylight, just so you can begin to visualize how your environment is going to be lit. And having some lights inside the scene will make your geometry creation a lot easier. You will see those shapes better. So do block out some lights, but keep them very simple. Alright, that looks pretty good to me. I think the scale, the dimensions, and the proportions are very good. And now I want to have a door, so it's not a doorway. I'm going to duplicate the subtractive brush. Resize it, make it smaller. And then change the brush type to additive. And we have our door. Let's go ahead and spawn inside the map and test everything out. This is looking pretty good. I'm happy with the size, with the scale, and the overall spatial relationship of architecture and furniture. And at this point I'm done with this room, but I'm not done with the layout. I want to add a section for the bathroom, and it's usually in the back. There's a small area for the sink, and then there's a doorway to a small bathroom. So I'm going to duplicate the wall and move it back. The bathroom section is going to be very simple. It's going to contain a small room and an entrance to it. So I'm going to duplicate the floor, move it back, and begin establishing the size for this back area. The entire back section is being eyeballed based on the dimensions and the proportions of the created room. So I don't have a specific size in mind, but rather than I'm using the existing room and the human reference scale to determine that size. I'm going to create a bathtub, and I'm going to carve out the interior of it using a subtractive brush. So I duplicated an additive brush I already had, resized it to the right size that I want, and then to carve out the interior, I duplicated the additive brush, changed the mode to subtractive, and then resized it so it's inside, carving out that interior space. And then I'm going to create a toilet using a couple of simple cube brushes. And I'm trying to find the right placement for the bathtub and the toilet. And I'm also going to make the space for the bathroom a lot smaller, because I want to make it feel claustrophobic and uneasy. And here I'm creating a sink using existing BSP brushes. So the size of the playable space has a lot to do with how you want the player to feel. The idea for this bathroom and this hotel room is very similar to the horror movie Vacancy. It's very old, not something you'd want to stay in, and you want to control and use the space to evoke a certain feeling in the player. And the size of the space can be used to do that. So making it very tight, compressed, and claustrophobic can make the player feel uneasy. So I like the size of this bathroom right now, and I'm gonna begin closing it off with the walls. So I've also duplicated a subtractive brush and moved it into position for the doorway. And then when I place an additive brush on top of it, the subtractive brush is not subtracting from the additive brush. So this has to do with the order at which each brush was created. To fix this, I'm going to select the subtractive brush and change its order inside the details panel to last. So the brush order is very important, and if you don't see certain brushes appear, change their order to first or to last. Alright, so I like the size of this section. Now I'm just going to fix a few minor issues on the bottom for the floor. Move the ceiling down, and then close off the bathroom and the small room next to the bathroom with the walls. And playtest. Go into the bathroom, take a look at the size, the dimensions, the proportions, the usual, making sure that everything is good. And it is, I like it. And for the last part, to finish this up, I'm going to duplicate the light in the back so I can see more and better. And I'm going to add a cabinet in the back In these type of motel rooms, there's usually a cabinet in the back next to the bathroom with a sink, or sometimes a closet. And then I want to have a very small window in the bathroom, right next to the shower. So I'm going to duplicate an existing window brush, move it to the back, and then resize it. And in a lot of horror movies, this is where somebody breaks in, or this is where you escape from. So it just adds another element of discomfort, knowing that there is another way to get inside the motel room. And then I'm also going to quickly duplicate the same brush, and I'm going to carve out the area for the sink. And one last addition is the door in the bathroom. I will keep it open, and it gives me a template to go off of. Alright, here we are. Everything has been blocked in. Let's do our final playtest and walk around the entire environment. So at this point, I'm done with the blackout, and I would move on to the next step, which is static meshing. I would either create my own static meshes or go find static meshes to use. And I would use the framework that was created with BSP brushes as my template. And I would begin to replace all these brushes with static meshes. Now, if I were to create my own static meshes, what I would probably do is create the entire room as one static mesh. This way I would have flat surfaces for the floor, for the walls, and the ceiling, and I would not have any light map issues when using baked lighting. And because the floor, the walls, and the ceiling would be one continuous surface, I would not have any light map seams. Unlike if you were to create modular meshes, then you would naturally get some light map seams in between meshes, which you would have to hide with additional meshes, such as columns, trims, and borders. And the bathroom, I would probably have that also as a separate piece. So the structure of the room, the floor, the walls, and the ceiling would be one static mesh. And then the bathroom with the floor, walls, and ceiling would be another static mesh. And then inside UE4, I would put them together like you see here in the BSP Blockout stage. And then I would create the props to populate the room and the bathroom. And if I were to create multiple rooms to make up the entire motel, it would be easy to take these pieces, the room and the bathroom, since all the rooms will be the same, and duplicate them to have those additional rooms. And then I would just vary the props inside each to make them slightly different. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, subscribe so you don't miss any more tutorials. And if you want to learn Unreal Engine 4 as an absolute beginner without wasting your time trying to look for this information yourself, get Unreal Engine 4 Fundamentals Volume 1, the Essential Beginner's Guide to Unreal Engine 4 course, where you will finally learn Unreal Engine 4 in just 7 hours. You'll find a link in the description below. Or if you're on the website, right above you go to Full Courses and click on UE4 Fundamentals Volume 1. And I will see you in the next video.